Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. If you are having trouble finding a seat, I know we've opened the overflow. There are also wonderful seats in the balcony, so. Wow, is all I can say. What a great crowd. I'm Paul Pribanow, the president here at Augsburg, and it is my great privilege to welcome all of you to the 7th Harry Emerson Fosdick Lecture on Preaching. Who would have imagined at a little Lutheran college in the middle of Minneapolis that we would host an annual preaching lecture? And it's been a great gift to us to be able to do this each of the past several years, and to be able to bring distinguished guests to campus who bless us with their understanding of how we share the word to the world. I want to say a special word of thanks to our events staff that is at the moment understaffed and is still doing a wonderful job preparing us for these wonderful events. To our campus ministry staff, Pastors Babette and John, Administrator Extraordinaire Janice, who's back there opening up the back room. But a special thanks to the Reverend Greg Renstrom, who, our wonderful friend, who is the instigator of this annual event and has been so generous with both his vision and his support for this. Greg, do you want to wave so folks can thank you for your wonderful areas in the back row of all places? But let's thank Greg. So again, it's wonderful to be here with you. I'd now like to introduce Pastor John Schwein, who will introduce our distinguished guest.
Good morning. So I'm John Rody Schwein. As President Pribanow mentioned, I'm one of the university pastors here at Augsburg, serving alongside Pastor Babette Chapman. And I have the privilege of introducing our speaker this morning. But first, a word about the namesake for this event, the Reverend Harry Emerson Fosdick. Reverend Fosdick was the founding pastor and preacher of the ecumenical Riverside Church in New York City. Regarded by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. as, quote, the greatest preacher of this century, Reverend Fosdick believed the task of preaching belonged in the public square, that proclamation of the gospel must enter the current lived anxieties, fears, and realities of people's lives. Fosdick was also a leading public critic of the growing fundamentalist movement within Christianity, and I think Reverend Fosdick would be encouraged to know that the topic our lecturer and preacher this morning brings takes one of his most influential sermons, Shall the Fundamentalists Win?, which he preached in 1922, and recontextualizes it to the ideology that threatens church and society today and is top of mind for many preachers this election cycle. We will hear, Shall the Christian Nationalists Win? Though Christian nationalism has long been present in this land, used to justify this nation's original sins of slavery, white supremacy, and genocide of Native peoples, it feels like it's on the ballot this year in an especially dangerous way. A poll released just yesterday by the Public Religion Research Institute found that 3 in 10 Americans either sympathize with or adhere to Christian nationalist ideas, with the majority of them living in the Southeast and Upper Midwest, and overwhelmingly expressing support for Donald Trump. We know the Christian nationalist agenda is contrary to the gospel, but how do we effectively preach and resist and offer an alternative vision of the Christian faith from the pulpit to congregations who are more divided than ever in an election year? Enter Reverend Barbara K. Lundblad, the Joe R. Engle Professor of Preaching Emerita at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Reverend Lundblad is ordained in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and in addition to her many academic homiletics posts, she has served for decades as a parish pastor, and I gotta add a campus pastor too. She is a recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Academy of Homiletics and a recipient of the Distinguished Alumni Award at Yale Divinity School, where she was also invited in 2000 to offer the Beecher Lectures, one of the most distinguished lecture series on preaching in the world. Reverend Lundblad is a pastor, prophet, author, teacher, mentor, friend, partner, and faithful follower of Jesus, who we are so honored to learn from together this morning. So please join me in welcoming Reverend Barbara Lundblad.
Well, thank you. This is an honor for me, and it is so good to see many, many friends here today. It feels like a bit of a reunion. So thanks for coming. And I also want to reach out to those of you who are watching this online, because I know that there are many people, probably as many as are here today, who are also watching online. How wonderful that Augsburg has started this preaching lectureship in honor of Harry Emerson Fosdick. The last time I preached at a Fosdick conference was at Riverside Church in New York City, where we used to have a Fosdick conference on preaching and worship. So it's wonderful to see that it's now come to the Midwest. As John noted, my title was stolen, in a sense, or updated from his sermon of 1922, Shall the Fundamentalists Win? And that sermon, he really didn't want to preach that sermon. It wasn't on the top of his agenda, and he didn't want to be a divider, but he felt that the fundamentalist forces were so powerful that he really had to preach it at the First Presbyterian Church in New York in 1922. This is about 8 years before he was called as the founding pastor of Riverside Church. Just an aside, Nicole and I lived in an apartment that was literally fastened to the wall of the organ pipes at Riverside Church. So there was no sleeping in on Sunday morning. That sermon that he preached was really preached to the church and was about what was happening within the church. In his own words, just a brief segment of that sermon. Already, all of us must have heard about the people who call themselves fundamentalists. Their purpose is to drive out from the Christian churches the consecrated souls who do not agree with their theory of inspiration. What immeasurable folly. Well, if he wanted that sermon to stay within First Presbyterian Church, it surely didn't. It went far and wide, and the fundamentalists wanted to get him out of the Presbyterian Church. And that charge against him was led by William Jennings Bryan, who had been Secretary of State, but probably is most remembered for being the lawyer who tried to defend the Tennessee law that forbid the teaching of evolution. And he actually won that case, so they could continue to teach evolution, although it changed later. But his witness on the witness stand was so discredited and even ridiculed that the fundamentalist project really was diminished. People thought, well, we can't believe this kind of thing that he's saying, and so you could say in some ways that Harry Emerson Fosdick's question, shall the fundamentalists win, was answered. No, they shouldn't win. But he himself felt that he had to leave First Presbyterian Church because he refused to submit to a heresy trial. So he left that church, and on his last Sunday there, the sanctuary was packed, and he said, "They call me a heretic. Well, I am a heretic if conventional orthodoxy is the standard. I should be ashamed to live in this century and not be a heretic." But there's nothing in that 1922 sermon that warned about any kind of takeover by the fundamentalists of the government of the United States. It was really a sermon about what was happening in the church. 102 years later, it is a different story. Christian nationalism has probably many definitions. I will just share one. Christian nationalism is a movement that believes the United States must be a Christian nation grounded in Christian values and principles, devoted to preserving Christian superiority. Notice that the word democracy does not appear. Now, some of you have probably heard already a clip of the beginning of the CPAC conference that was held recently, where a man named Jack Posobiec opened the conference with these words: "I just want to say, welcome to the end of democracy. We are here to overthrow it completely. We didn't get all the way on January 6th, but we will get there. We will get rid of it." And then he held up a cross necklace. And he said, "We'll replace it with this right here. That's right, because all glory is not to the government, all glory is to God." But that conference was mainly about the government. It's hard to pinpoint the exact theological underpinnings of the Christian nationalist movement, but they would be probably very similar to what Fosdick faced with the fundamentalists. And these are not really up for argument. The inerrancy of Scripture, the virgin birth, salvation through the atoning sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, and Jesus coming again in clouds of glory, and for many, a final battle of Armageddon. Think back to the Left Behind books. But if you really listen carefully, and John noted that survey that was done by PRRI recently, they said that there are two non-negotiables for the Christian nationalists. And it's not virgin birth, it's not the inerrancy of Scripture. It is, number one, access to guns, and two, immigration. Other cultural issues we know are important to this group of people: LGBTQ rights, abortion, and the country's tending toward what they would call socialism. But this title, Christian nationalism, really doesn't say it all. It should be noted that the title should be white Christian nationalism. And maybe that's understood, that word white is understood, but it should be there. It may be that there are black people who are part of this movement, but so very, very few. This is white Christian nationalism. It's really been the framework for the history of this country. From the time that slaves were brought to Virginia in 1619, on through thousands of slaves who were brought to this country. I can't even begin to emphasize how much this movement has to do with race. The Civil War was fought in spite of Nikki Haley's not having an answer to that question. It was really fought to preserve the right of white men to own slaves. And why not? This was big business. I didn't realize this until years ago. I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' article on reparations in The Atlantic. Slavery is big business. In 1860, just listen to this, I was so shocked. Slaves as an asset were worth more than all of America's manufacturing, all of the railroads, all of the productive capacity of the United States. Slaves were by far the single largest financial asset of property in the entire American economy. You can see why the Confederacy wanted to win this war. But to lose that war was for them culturally, religiously, and racially devastating. They had written the word God into their Confederate Constitution. The word God is not in the US Constitution. So this was a terrible blow. How could God let this happen? How could God allow the freeing of the slaves? How could God be so mean to good white people? But why now? Civil War was a long time ago. Why now this rise of white Christian nationalism? Well, the scaffolding had already been built for this movement, and I can't tell you how much I've deleted from this lecture, but you can read so much about this yourself, of what led to this movement now. I think a catalyst really was FDR's New Deal. People couldn't stand it, especially the business people. Anybody with money couldn't stand it. They did everything to denounce it, and they were very angry with his wife, Eleanor, who insisted on the equality of gender and race. So church people, Christian people, and business leaders came together to really denounce the New Deal. And this has been a tension now we have felt in the political landscape of the United States for many generations. But what about the Supreme Court decisions of just in the lifetime of many of us sitting here today? Brown versus Board of Education, surely in 1954, one of the ones that really got people mad. This was, to integrate the schools. And almost every city went through a terrible, terrible time of division over that decision. Or what about Roe versus Wade, 1973? The interesting thing about this decision of the court to allow for women to decide to have an abortion, within certain limits, always from the beginning, it was never the catalyst at the beginning. The Southern Baptist Convention had written into their platform that abortion was an honorable option, a faithful option. What drove the conservatives was the decision to deny tax exemption from Bob Jones University because they refused to admit black students. That was really that's what got people going. And then later on, they latched on to abortion. But abortion was not the beginning. Citizens United, treated corporations as a person. It's completely changed the landscape of funding for politics. Huge amounts of money now come into a political campaign. But one of the most interesting to me is Shelby versus Holder in 2013, which completely gutted the real heart of the Voting Rights Act. That act from 1965 was troubling to people, and they wanted to get rid of it, and they finally did. Paul Weyrich, who many of you know his name, and if you don't, just look him up. He's a very interesting fellow, really one of the founders of the modern GOP, and surely one of the leaders of what we now call white Christian nationalism. In 1980, he spoke to a group of evangelical Christians, and he said this: "I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been, and they never will. As a matter of fact, our leverage in elections goes up as the voting population goes down." It's made a huge difference. So you can see fight after fight after fight in almost every state to somehow suppress the vote. And then in 2003, 2013, and 2015, 3 decisions that honored the humanity and the rights of LGBT people. How could that be? How could that have happened? Gay marriage, it's against everything God ever wanted. And then alongside of this, the civil rights movement. Often you'll hear the gospel preached from the edges, from people who are oppressed will be the ones who will fight for democracy. And that surely was true with the civil rights movement. From Rosa Parks refusing to get up in 1955, to Martin Luther King, to Malcolm X, to the Black Panthers, to George Floyd, and Black Lives Matter. We love to hear Martin Luther King's dream. Especially we white people, we love to hear that dream where little black girls and little white girls will hold hands on the hills of Georgia. But the rest of the civil rights movement seemed like a nightmare to many white people. Then, of all the trouble, in 2008, Barack Obama was elected president of this country. It was way too much. Carter Hayward has a wonderful book called The 7 Deadly Sins of White Christian Nationalism, and she writes this: "We should not underestimate the fear and horror struck in the hearts of people in this country who could not imagine living under the authority of a black president. Most of what has happened in American politics since Obama's election has been motivated, at least in part, by the refusal of significant numbers of American Christians to accept even the possibility that the stranglehold of white male power had been broken. A black man in the White House was too much to bear. Fear has motivated so much of the white Christian nationalist movement. Fear that black lives matter more than white lives. Fear of black and brown immigrants pouring across the border. Fear that white people no longer are in charge. And fear that Christians are being persecuted. Where is this happening? Christians are not being put in concentration camps, not interned like the Japanese were during World War II. Christians have all kinds of TV stations and websites, and I mean, where are Christians being persecuted? Donald Trump has picked up on this fear. At an event last June, he said these words: "No president has ever fought for Christians as hard as I have. I got it done, and nobody thought it was even a possibility." Surely he means the courts, but many other things too. He's tapped into that fear, particularly since the election of Barack Obama. Oh, so what in the world shall we do? I'm not completely sure. I think we have to figure it out together. But those of us in this room who are called to preach, I think we have to preach about this. Even if you will not find a verse in the lectionary on white Christian nationalism. I had experienced shortly after we moved here that I opened up the Star Trib, and there on the front page, I said, oh my goodness, that looks like my friend Jeff. Huh. It was Jeff. And there he is over there. Pastor Jeff Sarton was there talking with a Muslim man, and they were in front of a big mural of Jesus' arrest. Jesus was there with his hands bound and a crown of thorn on his head. And I don't even know the occasion, but they were the same size as the people in the mural. So it looked like Jeff and this Muslim man were part of the trial somehow. Oh, I thought, I put that on my Facebook page and I said, that'll preach. Now, what did I mean? What did I mean by that? Did it mean that these two men in conversation were doing something that might get them arrested? Or did it mean that at the time, if we had been against the ban on Muslim travel, that we would be arrested? And then I thought, must every sermon from now on be political? It depends a lot on your definition of political. I have gone back because I had to do a lecture on Bonhoeffer's preaching a few years ago. I went back and looked at some of his sermons. He also lived in a very urgent time. And what kind of sermons would he preach? It's interesting to me that Dietrich Bonhoeffer came to study at Union in 1930, exactly when Harry Emerson Fosdick was called to the Riverside Church. I think Bonhoeffer felt much more at home at Abyssinian Baptist Church. He has often talked about what it meant for him to hear black preachers and to hear spirituals, and he actually brought recordings of the spirituals back to Germany, probably the first time they had been heard in Germany. He has two little books that were edited by two women containing all of his 70 sermons. It's really they're little books. I would recommend them highly, the collected sermons of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Isabel Best, who was one of his editors and translators, wrote this little paragraph to say, this was Bonhoeffer's world. This is what it was like. He went back to Germany, in 1931. So this was happening during his time there. On January 30, 1933, Hitler was named chancellor, even though he never won a majority in a national parliamentary election. His party only had a 38% majority. But, he was named chancellor because the conservatives in his party wanted to control him and his popular movement. But Hitler soon started a step-by-step plan for getting real power into his hands. Broke every law along the way and rapidly dispensed with constitutional rights such as freedom of the press and the freedom of a trial before imprisonment. That, of course, led to the concentration camps because nobody got a fair trial before they were sent to the concentration camps. This is the interesting part to me. Meanwhile, the force of Hitler's personality and his gift for public events such as rallies and torchlight processions turned public discouragement into hope and enthusiasm. So this was Bonhoeffer's world, surely an urgent time if there ever was one. But if you read his sermons, in many ways, they seem apolitical. He doesn't preach directly against the Third Reich. He doesn't preach against Hitler. He does write about these things. And he wrote a very powerful, daring essay called The Church and the Jewish Question. In that essay, he defended the Jews. He wrote against the Arian clause, and he reminded people that Jesus was a Jew. January 30, 1933, Hitler was named chancellor. By Easter, not long, many of the laws had been ditched. Many of the churches had been now under the authority of bishops named by the Reich. And on Easter Sunday, Bishop Hans Müser prepared a proclamation that was to be read in every church on Easter Sunday. And this was the proclamation. A state, he's talking about the new government here and the wonder of it. A state which brings into being again government according to God's laws should be assured not only of the applause, but also the glad and active cooperation of the church. With gratitude and joy, the church takes note that the new state bans blasphemy, assails immorality, establishes discipline and order, espouses the sanctity of marriage and Christian training for the young, kindling in thousands of hearts, in place of disparagement, an ardent love for Volk and fatherland. Happy Easter. We can almost hear the people singing, Deutschland has arisen today, Alleluia. Though he never preached overtly against the Reich, it is true that his sermons were political. He called the church always to obedience and faithfulness. The church must be obedient to the gospel of Jesus Christ, not to the Führer, not to the Third Reich, not to anything less than the gospel of Jesus. Now, our country is not Nazi Germany. But we hear echoes, don't we? More than echoes, some would say, to white Christian nationalism from the days of Hitler. This is an urgent time. More than anything today, that's what I hope we know. This is an urgent time. So I think those of us who preach, and if you're not a preacher here, you may talk to your preacher about this, your pastor. You may talk to your friends about it. You may write some things on your social media. But we want to preach with the urgency of this moment in our ears. The Bible is our friend, even though people interpret it in many different ways. The Bible is our friend, and the lectionary, believe it or not, is our friend. Because people know that we, the preacher, didn't choose the text. Although sometimes they accuse us of that how could you have preached on that text today? Well, I think that we have to preach biblically, theologically strong sermons with the urgency of this moment always underneath or beside or wherever it is that we can't forget. This is a different time than I have ever lived in. Now, you will not find a text about white Christian nationalism. at least not in those words. But as Fred Craddock, a wonderful teacher of preaching for many years, used to say over and over, every text has a surplus of meaning. Yeah? So, how do we preach the text with the urgency of this moment also beside us? Just one example. Coming up, the fourth Sunday of Lent, it'll be March 10th, so you have some time to work on this. I just want to focus on the most familiar. The text is John 3:14-21. So I won't focus on the snake on the pole, but the most familiar part of this text, which many people memorized as children. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but may have eternal life. Lots of places we could go. Sermon 1 might be this. Sermon 1 will deal with the tension between the promise that we won't perish and the exclusive claim that this is only promised to those who believe in the Son of God. Now, that's enough for a sermon right there. You can go with that. Sermon 2 might go in a different direction. We often hear, God so loved the world that he gave his only Son to die for us. Problem? That last part isn't in the text, is it? To die for us. We hear it even though it isn't there. When I was in high school, we had a book called Youth's Favorite Songs. I don't know who voted on that, but one of the choruses that we loved to sing, for God so loved the world, he gave his only Son to die on Calvary's tree, from sin to set me free. I don't know why it had such a lilting melody, but you can hear it. So many of our hymns are framed by this part that's not in the text. Now that could be a whole sermon. If Jesus didn't send his Son to die for us, what did Jesus send his Son to do? Well, there's a sermon right there. But surplus of meaning, urgency of this time in our ears. What about the very first words? For God so loved the world. Oh my. But doesn't God love America best? What about American exceptionalism? How could God love the world? And you could go many directions. Does this include Palestine and Israel? Does this include Russia and Ukraine? Now, this will depend on your setting, how big you want to make this. Does it include farmers and city folks? Does it include gay and straight? Now, am I going off in a bad direction here with so much emphasis on the world? Well, in the next verse, the world is repeated 3 times. Indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Oh, the world is important to God. Is it important also to us? So, lectionary is good, but don't hold it too tightly. Jesus didn't ever say, preach from the lectionary. So at times, and I think many of you already do this, step outside of the lectionary a bit to allow, say, a second reading from part of Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail. And don't just do this on Martin Luther King Day. You might read a poem by Maya Angelou, or you might read a poem by Patrick Caballo Hansel. He's here, has a wonderful book called Breathing in Minneapolis. Might be a very good second reading. Or think about the Sunday after Easter. It'll be April 7th. You may be not preaching at all then. But if you are, and you really have preached way too many times on Jesus and Thomas, because that text comes every year on the Sunday after Easter, you might remember that April 7th is 2 days before April 9th, the anniversary of the day that Bonhoeffer was hung in the prison in Nazi Germany, just about a week before the end of the war. That would give you a good excuse to preach about Bonhoeffer, about the world in which he lived, the urgency of his time. You might quote a part of his sermon or something from Letters and Papers from Prison. But this would be a very good time to preach about Bonhoeffer on the 7th of April. You might plan, and I know most of us are probably not into sermon series, but some of you may be, but I think between now and November, it would be wonderful to plan a series of sermons called Good Question, Pastor. And every sermon, and you could alert people to this ahead of time so they wouldn't know that you've abandoned the Bible, and you can surely find biblical quotes that fit with these themes, but how about a few questions? You could add your questions to these. What are white people so afraid of? Are Jews and Muslims welcome in a Christian nation? That's another Sunday. Here's another Sunday. What would happen to our country without immigrants? Who would take care of our elderly parents, for example? What would happen? I already said that one. Is the right to bear arms a God-given right? And you could just search through the Bible for that answer. And you could search through the Bible for this question: where are the biblical families in the Bible? Really, they're hard to find. I mean, you can have your own questions, but I'm just saying, maybe in the summer you would do this, or maybe you would do it from now until November. Not every Sunday. No, not every Sunday. But now and then, maybe once a month. And preach about race, and don't just don't just have it during Black History Month, which it is now. We've actually got an extra day this year because today is Leap Day. I think stories are often more powerful than facts. Lots of facts about racism in this country. How many of you have seen the movie Origin? I hope as many people as saw Barbie will see Origin. It's a movie that's based on Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, and you wonder how could Ava DuVernay make a story out of Caste, which is a nonfiction book, of course, but she tells wonderful stories in there, and I was so moved by this story of Al Bright. Al Bright was a little boy in this movie and in her book, and he was on a baseball team. He must have been like 8 or 9 in a little league team, and he was actually the person that helped them win this ball game. And so the coach and some of the parents, to celebrate, brought them to the swimming pool. Well, when they got there and they were getting ready to get in the pool, they had their trunks on and everything, and the director shouted to Al, "You can't go in that pool!" Well, he was the only black kid on the team. And the coach tried to argue with the director, but the director said, "If he goes in that pool, none of you can go in that pool." So they got a blanket for Al and they put it outside the fence, and some of the parents brought him some sandwiches and some other food. And we kept watching this, and he kept sitting out there. And finally, the coach had it, and he said, "This is not fair, let him come in." And so the director said, "Everybody out of the pool!" And then they let Al come in, and he was a kind of short kid, not very big kid, and the director said, "Go down that ladder and get on that raft. Don't touch the water. Just get on that raft." And so this little boy got onto the raft, and he was very, very still. He didn't want to move a muscle. And a lifeguard came and pulled that raft around the pool very slowly, and he kept saying, "Don't touch the water." It was so painful to watch it in the movie, and it seemed to go so slowly, the lifeguard pulling Al bright around the pool, and all the people standing around the edge, not quite knowing what to do. And the lifeguard kept saying, "Don't touch the water." It seemed like forever that the little black boy on the raft was making it around the pool, and he was so still. It was 1951. I could have been there. I don't know what I would have done, standing at the edge of the pool. Don't touch the water. If you touch the water, I will have to disinfect the whole pool. But it was 1951. Surely that wouldn't happen now. Not so long ago, in the New Hampshire primary, Donald Trump said, "Immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country. They're coming from Asia, from Africa, from Mexico. We got a lot of work to do. They're poisoning the blood of our country. Don't touch the water." This is an emotional story, for me anyway, because I try to picture myself there, standing by the pool, probably being afraid to do anything. White Christian nationalism is very emotional. It's not just about a list of facts. It's about how people feel, about where they are afraid, who they love and who they hate. Don't touch the water. I think our sermons need to be planned carefully so that we reach not only people's heads, but their hearts. So it's okay to preach some emotion in your sermons and to tell stories that could make people cry, because this is happening with the white Christian nationalist movement. But what if people don't want to hear this at all? You may preach in a place where people are open, even eager to hear more about white Christian nationalism. And I hope you're doing it. But you may serve a congregation that doesn't want to hear anything political on Sunday at all. Of course, people are talking about politics all week. and going to websites about white Christian nationalism all week. Do we have anything to be part of that conversation? Tim Alberta has written what I think is a lovely book called The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. The thing that's so helpful about it to me is that he is himself an evangelical Christian. He makes no apologies for it. It's the church he loves. He grew up in this church, and he takes us in the book to many different places, some where this movement is alive and well, and some where it's caused great divisions and caused pastors to leave. He has just an amazing interview with Russell Moore. Now, Russell Moore is not to be confused with Roy Moore, who put the 10 Commandments in the courthouse. I don't think they're even related, but Russell Moore had risen to a very high position in the Southern Baptist Church. He was the director of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Church. Huge position, deciding many policies for the Southern Baptists. But he began to ask too many questions about the racial policies of the SBC, and particularly about the charges being brought now by women about sexual abuse in the Southern Baptist Church. And then he made the fatal mistake. He wrote to Jerry Falwell Jr., and he denounced Donald Trump in public. He began to get vicious emails, he and his family. He finally decided he couldn't stay. He had to leave his position, and he left the Southern Baptist Church. When pastors around the country, evangelical pastors, heard this, they wrote to Russ Moore, and they wanted to meet with him. He said these words in the book: "I can't even count how many conversations I've had with pastors who've said, 'I'm crushed, I'm broken, I don't know what to do.'" Over and over, he's heard the same excuses or same reasons that they gave. It's COVID and wearing masks. It's critical race theory. It's Trump. These pastors, he says, are a shell of their former selves. The stress has made their job impossible. These pastors are going to leave their parishes because their congregants are against them. You may know pastors who are in this situation. You may be one of them. Maybe some of your seminary classmates are serving in places where there's nobody who wants to hear about white Christian nationalism. The PRRI sent out a survey, the group that John noted before. It stands for Public Religion Research Institute, and they do surveys of all kinds of things. But here's what they discovered about white Christian nationalism. Where they did a state by state. 50% of the people in North Dakota are either adherents or sympathizers with white Christian nationalism. 50%. In South Dakota, it's 42%. These are our neighbors. You probably went to school with some of the people serving there. How can we support each other? How can we talk to each other? How can we learn from each other? This is where I think a group like Braver Angels can be very important. They intentionally bring together people from red perspectives and people from blue perspectives and help them talk across divides. I think the churches need to have our own Braver Angels project. Just think of it. In the 60s, I was a youth director at Gloria Dei in St. Paul. At that time, the Minnesota Synod of the LCA, the whole state of Minnesota was one synod, except for the northwest corner, which was part of Red River Valley. So when we gathered together in conventions, rural people talked to city people and suburban people. So, a soybean farmer from Le Sueur might sit next to a 3M manager from St. Paul. Or there might be a farmer from, I don't know, some small town serving on reference and council committee with somebody from the synod. Well, now Minnesota has 6 synods. So the farmers can talk to each other, and the city people can talk to each other too. But not so good. I mean, maybe we need to restructure things, but this is not a sermon about restructuring the ELCA. I think all of us, whether we're preachers or members of congregations, need to let the Christian message become more visible. Whether it's a meme that you put on your Facebook page or TikTok or Instagram or things I've never even heard of, to get different words out there for people. I think we can't do this alone. I think we all should join some group. It could be Braver Angels or an indivisible group. It could be this new group called Christians Against Christian Nationalism Minnesota. You can find them online. They've just begun. They were started by a group of Baptist people in the Twin Cities. Isaiah, many of you are part of. Faithful America also has wonderful resources online. And of course, there are groups like the ACLU. I'm just saying, find a group. Don't try to do this alone. You'll really be discouraged. Get the word out. Gather people together. I think it would be great fun to get people in the congregation to come together, all ages, and design, say, bumper stickers or buttons or signs to put outside the church. Many of you do this now. I love it when I see, immigrants welcome here, or people of faith for reproductive rights, or the signs that Lutheran Campus Ministry has put in front of Grace Church. I go to church because I have doubts. We need to get a different message out there that Christian people are thinking about this in a different way. Love one another, signed Jesus. That's a nice button. Who could argue? I think you want to be careful what bumper stickers you use, because your car could get wrecked. But I'm just saying, there are a lot of messages out there that say Christians believe this and this and this. We need to say, well, we're Christians and we really want to welcome immigrants, whatever it is. You probably want to be careful. I know a local pastor whose daughter had a button that she put on her backpack that said, not all Christians are assholes. Now, you couldn't probably use that everywhere, but in some places it would work. And surely we can go beyond Bible verses with, I said before, some poetry, some, verses from a line from Martin Luther King. But it's very important for us to involve, we really need to involve young people in this, because we're afraid now that our son, for example, doesn't want to vote at all. Now we're going to try to convince him to vote because he doesn't like Joe Biden. And young people may be feeling that way, but students at Augsburg and the U of M, we have an entree with these students, and we have to, every student should have a button that says voting matters. There's a lot we can do. We need to be more visible. Make a t-shirt. Let justice roll down like waters. You know a lot of Bible verses that you'd like to have out there. do something with the things that you know and help other people in the congregation get involved too. So, shall the Christian Nationalists win? I pray the answer is no. For the sake of the country and for the sake of the Christian church. But we need each other in this task. We need to pray the last verse of Harry Emerson Fosdick's hymn, "Save us from weak resignation to the evils we deplore. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage, serving you whom we adore." And we need to remember the preaching of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, not because he's the only person that ever preached or the only Lutheran that's worth remembering, because he also lived at a very urgent time, a dangerous time, a time when the state took over the church. He wrote a sermon to his godson, which was never preached in a church or allowed anywhere. He sent it from prison in May of 1944. And this was for the little baby named after him, Dietrich Bethke, son of Renata and Eberhard Bethke, his dear friends. So he sent this sermon from prison. He said this: "Our church has been fighting during these years only for its self-preservation. It has become incapable of bringing the word of reconciliation and redemption to humankind and to the world. So the words we used before must lose their power, be silenced, and we can be Christians today in only two ways: through prayer and in doing justice among human beings. Prayer and doing justice." And some of us may feel that we're preaching to the choir, but even the choir needs some new songs. I offer just one. It's a kind of simplistic takeoff on Wonderful World, with apologies to the writers and to Louis Armstrong, except my voice now is almost as raspy as his. Just changed a few words, a new song for the choir. I see farms so green, big cities too, people of every culture and hue, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I hear babies cry, we watch them grow. They're all our children, this much I know. And I say to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, God's promise in the sky. The colors on the faces of people passing by. It can be very hard to say, how do you do? How can we ever say, I love you? I see fields of grain, skyscrapers too. I love this country just as much as you. Can we say to ourselves, what a wonderful world? Oh God, help us to see it's a wonderful world. Thank you very much.
Wow. What a gift. And what a proclamation and a call for us today. And we're going to keep hearing a good word from Pastor Lundblad at our daily chapel time at 11:30. And I think we're actually going to just take a break starting now. People can use the restroom, get refreshments, mingle. Barbara, we're kind of skipping the Q&A, but Barbara will be available during that time if you have questions for her or want to engage. Please engage with each other over what you just heard. Be a group, be a community in this work that we're doing together. And then please be back. We're going to reset the space. We'll hear Barbara preach a sermon for us as part of our daily chapel. So we're going to reset, and we will try to start as close to 11:30 as possible. So please be back in your seats at 11:30. Thank you.